Great class. So we are on the final week of information. So in chapter 15, we're going to talk about working capital and current assets management. Okay. So our goals in this chapter are understanding what working capital management is, net working capital, and the related trade-off between profitability and risk. We're going to be able to describe the cash conversion cycle, funding requirements, and key strategies for managing that. We're going to discuss inventory management, differing views, common techniques, and international concerns. We're going to explain the credit selection process and the quantitative procedure for evaluating changes in credit standards. Then we're going to review procedures for quantitatively considering early payment discount changes, as well as other aspects of credit terms and credit monitoring. And then we'll understand the management of receipts and disbursements, including float, speeding up collections, slowing down payments, cash concentration, zero balance accounts, and investing in marketable securities. So let's look at net working capital fundamentals first. So working capital, or short-term financial management, is management of our current assets and current liabilities. The goal here is to manage our current assets and liabilities to achieve a balance between profitability and risk that contributes positively to our firm's value. A survey of CFOs from firms around the world suggests that working capital management sits at the top of the list of most valued finance functions. Among 19 different finance functions, CFOs viewed working capital management as equally important as capital structure, debt issuance and management, bank relationships, and tax management. Their satisfaction with the performance of working capital management was quite the opposite, though. CFOs viewed the performance of working capital management as better only than that of pension management, okay? So consistent with their views that working capital management is a high value but low satisfaction activity, CFOs identified working capital as the finance function's second most in need of additional resources. So working capital, this is the portion of the firm's assets used in our day-to-day transactions. The primary elements of working capital circulate from one form to another in the ordinary course of business. So net working capital is the difference between the current assets and the current liabilities. It is positive when those assets are above our current liabilities and negative when the assets are below current liabilities. The conversion of current assets from inventory to accounts receivable to cash provides an important source of funds that firms use to pay those current liabilities. In general, the greater the margin by which the firm's current assets cover those current liabilities, the greater the firm's ability to pay their bills as they come due. There's a trade-off between profitability and risk, okay? The trade-off exists between the profitability and the risk, and that risk in context of our working capital management is the probability that our firm's going to be unable to pay those bills as they come due. So then we talk about insolvency, okay? This is when the firm is unable to pay those bills as they come due. Other things being equal, the greater the firm's net working capital, the lower the risk of insolvency. So in other words, the more net working capital, the more liquid the firm, and therefore lower the risk of becoming insolvent, okay? But having a lot of liquidity might reduce that profitability. So we need to look at changes in current assets. So to understand that changing level of the assets and how that affects the profitability, we look at risk trade-off. We consider the ratio of current assets to our total assets, okay? That ratio indicates a percentage of total assets that is current. And when that ratio increases, when the current assets increase, profitability decreases. Fixed assets add more value to a firm's products than their current assets, okay? So here's the effect of changing ratios on profit and risk. So with current assets divided by total assets, when there's a change in this ratio and an increase, it's going to decrease our profit and decrease our risk, okay? When our current liabilities over our total assets increase, we're going to have an increase on our profit and an increase on our risk, right? We're adding more liabilities in, right? Here is the yearly median for all U.S. listed non-financial companies from 1950 to 2019. So you can see that the current assets to total assets ratio there has steadily declined. The inventory to total assets has also declined, but the cash to total assets hit a little bit of a lull there, 70s, 80s or so, but that's back on the incline here. Other things being equal, if firms cut back on their current assets, they tend to increase risk. While firms are increasing their risk by cutting back on those current assets, they're increasing their holdings of the least risky current asset, which is cash. We also need to look at changes in current liabilities. So these changes can also affect that profitability risk trade-off. This can be measured by using the ratio of our current liabilities to our total assets. And when that ratio increases, our profitability is going to increase because those current liabilities are a less expensive source of financing than long-term debt or even equity. And those current liabilities are less expensive because they're less risky. They bear no interest except for notes payable. However, when the ratio of current liabilities to total assets increases, the risk of insolvency also increases because the increase in current liabilities decreases our net working capital. So the opposite effects on profit and risk result from a reduction in the ratio of current liabilities to total assets. We also need to look at the cash conversion cycle, or the CCC. The length of time between when a firm pays cash for raw materials and when it receives cash from collecting those receivables. So we need to look at the operating cycle, the OC. This is the time from the beginning of the production process to the collection of cash when the sale from that finished product is complete. So OC is going to equal the average age of inventory, the AAI, plus the ACP, which is the average collection period. We also need to take a look at the average payment period, the APP. This is the time it takes to pay the accounts payable measured in days. So the formula for the cash conversion cycle, the CCC, is going to be our OC minus our APP. So substituting the relationship in 15.1 into 15.2, we can see the cash conversion cycle has three main components, right? The average age of inventory plus the average collection period minus the average payment period. Each day of the cycle represents a day for which the firm needs financing to sustain its operations. So the longer the cash conversion cycle, the greater the firm's financing need. So if a firm changes any of the components of the cash conversion cycle, it's changing its financial resources tied up in those day-to-day operations. A firm can lower its working capital if it can speed up its operating cycle. So if a firm accepts bank credit like Visa cards, it'll receive that cash sooner after the sale is transacted than if it has to wait for the customer to pay its accounts receivable. So an example, in 2020 10-K filing with the SEC, Best Buy reported that it had revenues of $43.64 billion, cost of goods sold of $33.59 billion, accounts receivable of $1.15 billion, inventory of $5.17 billion, and accounts payable of $5.29 billion. From this information, and we're assuming the cost of goods sold equals purchases for simplicity, we can determine that the company's average age of inventory was 56 days. Its average collection period was 10 days, and its average payment period was 57 days. So the cash conversion cycle for Best Buy was just only 9 days, okay? So that's the 56 plus the 10 minus the 57. So we're going to look at that as a timeline. So here is the timeline of its operating cycle, and then the average age of inventory, the average collection period. So out of the 66 days in the operating cycle, right, that's the total, that's made up of the average age of inventory and the average collection period. So 56 days of inventory, 10 days of collection, right? So then we look at the APP of 57 days, and we can see that the CCC is 9 days. So cash outflow and cash inflow is only a 9-day difference, okay, where they would pay their accounts payable. If we add Best Buy's inventory and receivable balances and subtract the accounts payable, we find the company has $1.03 billion invested in working capital components of the CCC. That gives the company plenty of motivation to make improvements. Changes in any component of the cycle will change the resources tied up in their operations. So for example, if Best Buy could reduce their inventory from 56 to 50 days, holding all else equal, the working capital requirement would fall by almost $570 million, which is why a lot of companies pay close attention to this capital management. So here's operating cycle and cash conversion cycle for a lot of firms that we see out there today. Nordstrom's, Wendy's, Walmart, Goodyear Tire. Then we need to look at the funding requirements of the CCC. So a positive cash conversion cycle creates a need for funding that can be permanent or seasonal, and it can be funded with strategies ranging from aggressive to conservative. So when we look at permanent versus seasonal funding needs, permanent funding requirements are an investment in those operating assets that grow as the firm does, but they don't vary seasonally. Whereas the seasonal funding requirement has operating assets that vary over time as a result of seasonal sales. If the firm's sales show no seasonal pattern and sales may be growing over time, but the CCC is relatively steady, this creates a permanent funding requirement. Okay. There's no need to cover the gap between the cash payments and collections that grows as the firm does, and that doesn't vary seasonal. Okay. If the firm sales are seasonal, its investment in operating assets will vary over the year, and the firm will have that seasonal funding requirement on top of that permanent funding required to cover their operating assets at times when the cycle is relatively short. So here's the seasonal pattern of Mattel's operating and cash conversion cycle. So the operating cycle is in blue, the cash conversion is in red. Nicholson Company holds on average 50,000 in cash and marketable securities, about 1.25 million in inventory and 750,000 in accounts receivable. This business has been very stable over time, so the operating assets can be viewed as permanent, okay? No seasonal here. They also have accounts payable of 425,000 that are also stable over time. So they have permanent investing in operating assets of $1.625 million. So that would be the 50,000 plus the 1.25 million plus the 750, and then we're going to take out those accounts payable. Okay, so this would also equal that permanent funding requirement. But in contrast, Semper Pump Company, which produces bicycle pumps, has seasonal funding needs. They have seasonal sales. Their peak sales are driven by the summertime purchases or of those bicycle pumps. So they hold at minimum 25,000 in cash and marketable securities, 100,000 in inventory, 60,000 in accounts receivable. At peak times, their inventory increases to 750,000 and their accounts receivable increase to 400,000. So to capture this production efficiency, we want a constant rate throughout the year. So accounts payable remained at 50,000 throughout the year, okay? So we look at their permanent funding requirement for the minimum level of operations. We see that's the 25 plus the 100 plus the 60 minus 50. Okay, so that's 135,000. And peak seasonal funding requirements of 990,000. Okay, so that's the 25 plus now 750 plus 400 minus 50 minus the 135 that we already had for fixed permanent funding, right? So their total funding requirements vary from a minimum of the 135, that's their permanent, to the seasonal peak of 1.125 million. That's the 135 plus the 990, right? So here is a depiction of the Semper Pump's total funding requirements and how you can see how the seasonal need addresses that total need. And it wouldn't be relatively stable like we saw at the beginning of this example. So we can also look at aggressive versus conservative seasonal funding strategies. Short-term funds are typically less expensive than long-term ones, of course. Equity is another source of long-term funding, and the cost of equity is a lot higher than the short-term debt cost. The long-term funds allow firms to lock in their cost of funds over a period of time and avoid that risk of the short-term rate, those increases. Long-term funds minimize the refinancing risk, which is a risk that the firm's not going to be able to obtain money when they need it. With the aggressive funding strategy, we're going to see that the firm's going to fund their seasonal requirements with short-term debt and its permanent requirements with long-term debt or equity. This type of strategy normally saves money compared to an approach that utilizes those long-term funds more heavily. With a conservative funding strategy, the firm's going to fund both the seasonal and permanent funds with that long-term debt or equity. So we're going to look at Semper Pump Company again. They have the permanent funding requirement of 135 in operating assets. The seasonal fundings vary between 0 and that 990. So the average is about 101 to 50. So suppose they can borrow short-term funds at 6.25%, and long-term at 8%. An aggressive strategy means that they're going to take out a long-term loan equal to the permanent funding and the short-term loans equal to the seasonal needs. So the annual cost of the aggressive strategy for seasonal funding is going to be the cost of short-term financing, which is going to be that 6.25% times that average need, plus the cost of long-term financing. So the 8% times the 135. So this total cost is 17,128 and some change. But they can choose the conservative strategy and take out that 1.125 at 8% to cover that peak financing requirement. There's no short-term debt. During periods when the funding is needed below peak, they have that excess cash to invest. So we're going to take a look at that, where the cash surplus is going to be the difference between the amount borrowed and the total funding needed. So because the permanent funding need is 135 and the excess cash is 990 at its maximum point. However, the average seasonal funding is the 101,250. So the average excess cash is going to be $888,750. Suppose Semper can earn a 5% return on that excess cash that they have, right? So the cost of the conservative strategy is going to be the cost of long-term financing. So that 8% times a 1.125 million or $90,000. And then we're going to take out the earnings on the surplus balances. So that $888,000 amount times that 5% return. And so we see the total cost of the conservative strategy is $45,562. So these calculations demonstrate that Semper, for this company, the aggressive strategy is far less expensive than the conservative strategy. The extra expense of the conservative approach effectively eliminates the risk that the cost of the short-term funds goes up and that Semper is turned down by lenders for that short-term funding when it needs that temporary cash. So managers have to decide whether the reduction in risk is worth the added cost. Where Semper operates between the extremes of aggressive and conservative seasonal funding strategies, it depends on what the management's disposition towards their risk is and that strength of its banking relationship. So we need to look at some strategies for managing the cash conversion cycle. So to maximize the shareholder wealth, managers really need to work with minimizing the length of that CCC, which minimizes the need for costly financing. Managers can achieve that goal by implementing a combination of these following strategies. They can either turn over inventory as quickly as possible without stockouts that result in lost sales, or they can collect accounts receivable as quickly as possible without losing sales from high pressure collection techniques or maybe credit terms that aren't competitive with the market. They can achieve those goals by implementing, these other strategies as well. They can manage mail processing and clearing time to reduce when collecting from customers and increase them when paying suppliers. And then they could also pay accounts payable as slowly as possible without damaging that firm's credit rating or their relationship with their suppliers. So then we need to look at inventory management. So there are different viewpoints about inventory level. These viewpoints about appropriate inventory levels, they commonly differ among the finance, the marketing, the manufacturing, and the purchasing manager departments, right? So financial managers push to keep the inventories lean to free up resources for more profitable uses. Marketing managers would actually like to have larger inventories, though, because they ensure that all the orders are filled quickly, eliminating the need for back orders due to stockouts. The manufacturing manager's major responsibility is to implement a plan to produce those finished goods that are acceptable quality at a low cost, right? So they prefer to keep raw materials inventories high to avoid those production delays, and they favor large production runs for the sake of lower unit production costs, which result in high finished good inventories. Those procurement managers focus on raw material inventories they have to have on hand in the correct quantities at the desired times and favorable price, whatever raw materials are required by production. So they might buy larger quantities of resources than are actually needed to obtain discounts or anticipate those rising prices or maybe a shortage of certain materials. So there are some common techniques for managing inventory. So there's the ABC system. This is an inventory management technique that provides inventory into three groups, A, B, and C, and in descending order of importance and level of monitoring on the basis of dollar investment in each. So group A receives the most intense monitoring because they have a high dollar investment. B groups are frequently controlled through periodic, maybe weekly checking of their levels. And then managers are going to monitor C groups with unsophisticated techniques like the two-bin method. The two-bin method is an unsophisticated inventory technique that's applied to those Group C items. It involves reordering inventory when one of two bins is empty. We can also look at the economic order quantity, or the EOQ model. This is a technique to determine an item's optimal order size, which is the size that minimizes the total of the order costs and those carrying costs. So what are the order costs? They are the fixed clerical costs of placing and receiving an inventory order, and carrying costs are the variable costs per unit of holding an item in inventory for a specified period of time. This model works by trading off two categories of inventory costs, those order costs and those carrying costs. So order costs decrease as the size of the order increases and the number of orders falls. Carrying costs, however, they increase with increases in order size. So the EOQ model analyzes the trade-off between order costs and carrying costs to determine that order quantity that minimizes the total inventory cost. So there's a mathematical development for the EOQ. It's a formula that can be developed for determining the firm's EOQ given inventory, where the S is equal to the usage of units and period. The O is the cost per order. Q is the quantity in units. And C is the carrying cost, okay? So here is that equation. So the order cost is equal to the cost per order times the number of orders. So O times S divided by Q. The carrying cost is the cost per unit times the average inventory. So C times Q divided by 2. So our total inventory cost, the sum of our order cost and the carrying cost, is equal to O times S divided by Q plus C times Q divided by 2. The EOQ and the order quantity that minimizes the total cost function is in 15.7, where we see that that's the square root of 2 times S times 0 O divided by C, okay? So let's look at the personal finance example here. Individuals sometimes are confronted with personal finance decisions that involve those trade cutoffs, the trade-off similar to the trade-off between fixed order costs and variable carrying costs of inventory that a corporation could face. So let's take the case of the Von Dams, right? They supplement income they earn from their primary jobs by painting houses in their spare time. They estimate that over the course of the year, they're going to buy 250 gallons of paint at an average cost of $20 a gallon. So for every trip that they make to the paint store, they spend about $10 in gas and other costs related to wear and tear on their personal vehicle. They store the paint in a self-storage unit and estimate that they spend about $2 per gallon of paint in those storage costs. So how often should they visit that paint store? How much paint should they purchase on each visit? So let's use the EOQ model. So we have S is 250, the O is $10, the C is $2. So our EOQ is 2 times the 250 times 10 divided by 2, and we're taking the square root of that. So we see the 50. So they need to purchase 50 gallons of paint each time they visit the store. Given the annual use of 250 gallons, they're going to make that 5 trips to the store per year. With the EOQ model, there's a reorder point. This is the point to reorder inventory. And this is equal to the days of lead time times that daily usage. We also can look at safety stock. So that's extra inventory that's held to prevent those stockouts of important items. So Max Company is a producer of dinnerware, has an A group inventory that costs $1,500, and they use 1,100 units of the item per year. They want to determine their optimal order strategy for the item. So we need the following inputs. The order cost is $150, and the carrying cost is $200. So let's find the EOQ, right? 2 times the quantity of 1,100 times 150, the order, divided by the carrying cost, C. We get about 41 units when we take the square root of that. So we round up, 41. So the reorder point depends on the number of days that they're operating per year. So they operate 250 days a year. They use 1,100 units of the item. Their daily usage is going to be that divided by the 250, or 4.4 units. So if its lead time is 2 days and they want to have that safety stock of 4 units, the order point then is going to be 2 times that 4.4, because we have 2 days for a lead time, plus the 4 units. Okay, so 12.8 units. However, orders are only made in whole units, so we need to place an order when the inventory falls to 13, because we're going to round up at 12.8. Another technique is the just-in-time, the JIT system, okay? Inventory management technique that minimizes inventory by having materials arrive exactly when they're needed. The goal is manufacturing efficiency. It uses inventory as a tool for attaining efficiency by emphasizing quality of the materials used and that timely delivery. There are some systems for resource control. So we could look at the materials requirement planning, the MRP system. So this applies the EOQ concepts, compares production needs to available inventory balances, and determines when to place orders based on a product's bill of materials. Okay, so that bill of materials is a list for all the parts and materials that go into making that finished product. We also could look at computerized systems for resource control, and this could be through the materials resource planning to the MRP2. This is an extension of the MRP. It just uses software to integrate data from numerous areas like finance, accounting, marketing, engineering, and manufacturing, and generates those production plans as well as numerous financial and management reports. And then finally, we can look at the enterprise resource planning, the ERPs. This is an electronic integration of external information about their suppliers and the customers with the firm's department data to reduce production delays and control costs as well. So we also need to make sure that we have accounts receivable management. We need to manage our accounts receivable to collect our receivables as quickly as possible without losing sales from those high pressure collection techniques, or by offering credit terms that are not competitive in the industry. So we can do this in three ways: credit selection and standards, credit terms, and credit monitoring. So credit selection and standards. Credit standards are the minimum requirements that we're extending credit to a customer. So there are 5 C's of credit that a credit analyst use to look at for in-depth analysis. One is the character, their record of meeting past obligations, their capacity. Are they able to repay the credit based on cash flow focused analysis of their financial statements? Capital, their debt relative to equity. Collateral, can they pledge to secure the credit? So more valuable collateral increases the chance that the creditor is going to recover the funds if the applicant defaults. And then 5 conditions. Those are the current general and industry specific economic conditions and any possible unique conditions surrounding that specific transaction. Then we look at credit scoring. So this is a selection method used with high volume, small dollar credit requests. It relies on credit score determined by applying statistically derived weights to those applicant scores on key financial and credit characteristics. Then we look at changing credit standards. So sometimes analysts sometimes contemplate changing those credit standards to improve returns and create greater value for owners. So to demonstrate, consider the following chart where we're looking at changes and effects on profits that result from the relaxation of those standards. So the variable is sales volume. If we relax that, we are going to have an increase effect of the credit standard relaxation. So that's going to have an effect positively on our profits, okay? Investment and accounts receivable. If we are looking at, relaxing our credit standards for that, it's going to increase that, but it's going to have a negative effect on our profits, right? Because that means that the people have outstanding bills still and they need to pay us. So we're going to relax getting those bills paid from them. If we relax the bad debt expenses, that's going to increase, if we increase those and, relax those standards, it's also going to have a negative impact on our profits. So let's take a look at this example here. Dodge Cast Iron manufactures pots and pans for the home cook. They currently sell a product for $100 a unit. Sales, all on credit, for last year were 60,000 units. The variable cost per unit is $60. The firm's total cost fixed are $1.2 million. So currently those customers pay in 30 days and bad debts are about 1% of the sales. So Dodge believes that it allows customers to pay in 60 days, sales will increase to 63,000 and bad debts will rise to 2%. Do we think this relaxation of credit standards will benefit the shareholders? So let's take a look at this. It's really looking at capital budgeting problem that requires a comparison between the cash flow stream that Dodge generates under the current policy and the cash flows it would generate under that new policy. The better policy is obviously the one that provides that higher NPV, right? So fixed costs are irrelevant because they're not going to change whether the policy does. So consider the timing and the magnitude of cash flows. So let's see that their variable production costs at the start of each month, they collect it in 30 days. So with that initial outlay and the cost of making the first batch of 60,000, we're looking at 60 times 60,000 is 3.6 million. In 30 days, two things happen. First, the firm collects on 99% of the sales it makes at the start of the month. So the collection on sales is 99% times 100 times that 60,000, so 5.94 million. Second, they sell another 60,000 on credit, manufactures them, pays those variable costs. So again, the cost of manufacturing is at 3.6 million. So this means that the net cash flow in 30 days is going to be the 5.94 minus the 3.6. So we have 2.34 million. That's our net cash flow every 30 days from now. That repeats month after month. If they receive payment from its last batch of pans, it sells a new batch and pays the variable costs of manufacturing. So the cash stream from the current policy for the credit, it starts that perpetuity in 30 days. So assuming the cost of capital is only 1% a month, the NPV can be calculated to see that it's $230.4 million. Now let's consider this new credit policy, right? Sales are going to jump to 63,000 units, they say. Bad debts rise to 2%. Those variable costs are still $60 per unit. At the beginning of the first month under the new policy, the firm's going to build 63,000 units, pay those associated variable costs. So we can see here that the $60 now times 63,000 is 3.7 million. In 30 days, we are not going to receive any payment, but it sells and manufactures another 63,000 units, which costs another 3.78 million. So finally, in 60 days, the firm's going to receive payment for 98% of those initial sales. And once again, they're going to produce another batch of pans. So this net cash flow in 60 days that we can see here is 2.394 million. So now we can take that and they collect on that every 2 months and manufactures the next batch of orders. So we can see that they have an initial outflow, an outflow in the first month, and then a perpetuity from the second month on. So the NPV of the new policy is just under $230 million. So the last term in the NPV may need a little more explanation. So the present value of the perpetuity equals the cash flow divided by the discount rate, provided that the perpetuity begins in one period. Here, a period is 1 month, but the perpetuity starts in 2 months, not one. So we need to calculate the present value that starts in 2 periods, requiring a discounting of the basic perpetuity formula. So that's 2.394 million divided by 0.01, that additional period. There's barely any difference in the present values of the two credit policies, but the new policy is marginally less attractive. So they really shouldn't make it, okay, so they shouldn't make that change because our NPV current is higher than our NPV new. It may come as no surprise, but the largest companies receive the best credit terms from their suppliers, right? A recent study of almost 30,000 credit contracts found that large companies received terms that gave them more time to pay compared with smaller firms. Those larger firms were able to extract the most favorable credit terms from their smallest suppliers, as shown below. For example, when the small firm grants credit to another firm, they give their customer 40.1 days to pay on average. But when small firms grant credit to larger ones, those terms go up to 66.3 days to pay. So then we could talk about credit terms. These are the terms of sale for the customers who've been extended credit by the firm. We could offer early payment discounts. So this is a percentage deduction from the purchase price available to the credit customer that pays its account within a specified period of time. A firm's business strongly influences its regular credit terms. So those regular credit terms tend to match what the industry standards are, but individual customer terms should reflect the riskiness of that customer. With that early payment discount, it includes an early payment discount that's an effective way to create that incentive for customers to pay quickly. By speeding collections, this also decreases those investments in accounts receivable, but also decreases the per unit profit, right? We're discounting it a little bit. Additionally, initiating the discount should reduce those bad debts because the customers are going to pay sooner, and it should increase our sales volume because they Those who take the discount pay a lower price for the product. So firms that consider offering a discount have to perform that benefit cost analysis to determine whether extending that discount is profitable. There's an early payment discount period. These are the number of days after the beginning of the credit period which the payment discount is available. So assessing how changes in discount period affects the firm's value is difficult because there's a lot of offsetting forces involved. So for example, if a firm were to change its credit terms from 210 net 30 to 220 net 30, the following changes may occur. Sales may increase, which positively affects profit. Bad debts may increase, which negatively affects profit. And the profit per unit decreases because more people are going to take the discount, which negatively affects our profit, right? So basically what that credit term is 210 would be you get a 2% discount if you pay in 10 days, but you still have a net 30 payment. Okay, so it's due still within 30 days. If they change it from 10 days to 20 days, you still get that 2% discount. You get a little bit more time to get that discount, but the payment is still due net 30 days. So how an increase in the early discount period affects the accounts receivable balance is also hard to predict because accounts receivable may fall because some customers don't currently take advantage of that discount. So two other factors tend to increase receivables. Customers who are already taking the discount will continue to do so, but they're going to pay later. And new customers attracted by the new policy will result in new accounts receivable. We could look at credit terms, the credit period. This is the number of days after the beginning of the credit period until the full payment of the account is due. So changes in the credit period, they also affect a firm's profitability. So for example, increasing the firm's credit period from net 30 days to net 45 days increases our sales, which positively affects our profit. But both the investment in accounts receivable and bad debt expenses would also increase, which negatively affects our profit. We also have to look at credit monitoring, the ongoing review of our accounts receivable to determine whether the customers are paying according to our stated credit terms. With that, we need to look at the average collection period, the number of days that credit sales are outstanding. So this is equal to the accounts receivable divided by the average sales per day. Knowing this collection period enables the firm to determine whether there's a general problem with accounts receivable. We also have to look at the aging of accounts receivable by looking at the aging schedule. This is a technique that breaks down accounts receivable into groups on the basis of their time of origin. It indicates the percentages of the total accounts receivable balance that have been outstanding for specific periods of time. So let's take a look at this example. The accounts receivable balance for Kessner Consulting on December 31 was $200,000. The firm extends net 30-day credit terms to its customers. To gain insight into their relatively lengthy 51.3-day average collection period, they prepared the following aging schedule. So we can see on the left-hand side, age of accounts 0 to 30, 31 to 60, 61 to 90, 91 to 120, over 120. Balance outstanding in those specific groups ranges, and the percentage of total balance outstanding. So we can see over 120 days is at 3%. 61 to 90 is at 26%, which is a bit high. And then a bulk of the group is still at 0 to 30. So when we see that the 51.3 days, because we see that they're getting in between that 0 to 90 day payment schedule of repaying their debts to the Kessners. So again, because they extend the 30-day credit terms to their customers, they have 30 days after the end of the month to remit payment to the Kessners. So we see that 40% of the accounts are in this the age 0 to 30 days. The remaining 60% are overdue. So again, everything over 30 days. So 18% of the balance is in the 1 to 30 days, 26% is 31 to 60, 13 is 61 to 90, and 3% is more than 90 days. So although the collections seem generally high, and slow, it's a high percentage that the balance outstanding is in that 31 to 60 days overdue, right? So obviously a problem must have occurred 61 to 90 days ago. So we have to investigate what that problem could be. It could be that they hired a new credit manager. The acceptance of a new account made a large credit purchase, but they haven't paid for it. Or maybe there's an ineffective collection policy. So when analysts find that type of discrepancy in the aging schedule, they need to determine, evaluate, and remedy that cause. There are some common collection techniques that firms can use. They range from letters to legal actions. As an account becomes more and more overdue, the collection effort becomes more intense. So here are some common collection techniques. So again, there's letters, telephone calls, personal visits, collection agencies, and then finally legal action. So not only do we look at accounts receivable, we also have to look at the management of our receipts and those disbursements. So this is the third component of our cash conversion cycle, which is the average payment period. It's got two parts: the time from purchase of goods on account until the firm mails that payment, and the receipt, processing, and collection time required by those firm suppliers. So part two is the focus of our receipts and disbursements management, okay? So with that, we can look at float. These are funds that have been sent by the payer but are not yet usable funds to our payees. This is an important part of the CCC because it lengthens the firm's average collection period and its average payment period, APP. The goal of the firm should be to shorten the average collection period and lengthen that average payment period. It's got three component parts. Mail float. This is the time delay between when the payment is placed in the mail and when it's received. Processing float is the time between a receipt of the payment and the deposit into the firm's account at the bank. And a clearing float is the time between the deposit of the payment to the bank and when those spendable funds become available to the firm. This component is attributable to the time required for a check to clear in the banking system. So depending on how large it could be, it could be a 1 business day or 2 business day transaction. With that, we want to speed up our collections. This reduces customer collection float time and reduces our average collection period, which is going to decrease the investment the firm's got to make in the CCC. So accelerating collection frees up resources for other uses. So let's take a look at this example. Rosebud Toys has annual credit sales of $10 million or daily sales of $27,397, which is the $10 million divided by 365, and 8 days of total collection float, which is the receipt, processing, and collection time. They can reduce the float by 3 days. It's going to free up 82,000 and some change, right? If the company plans to hold these assets in an interest-bearing account, then the annual benefit's about $1,644. If reducing the float by 3 days costs less than that $1,644, then the net benefit is positive. On the other hand, if they plan to use those new funds to invest in projects that earn 9% cost of capital, then the annual benefit from reducing that float is $73.97. By speeding up collections, one of those ways that we could do that is a lockbox system. This is a collection procedure where the customers are mailing their payments to a post office box that is emptied regularly by the firm's bank, which processes the payments and deposits them into the firm's account. It speeds up that collection time by reducing processing time as well as mail and clearing time. This occurs a lot in the insurance industry. Anytime a customer wants to make their payment for an insurance policy, they do send it to a P.O. box. For the company that I work with, that's down in Texas. So there's a lot of mail flow, but they use this lockbox system that is emptied twice a week is what it is. They do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So for decades, the Postal Service has been struggling financially. In 2015, they announced that to cut costs, it would dramatically reduce the number of mail processing facilities that it operated. So for companies, this meant a change of increase in mail flow. So for Fifth Third Bank, it's an opportunity. They announced a new remote lockbox capture program in which business-to-business payments could be retrieved at local post offices around the country. Next, Fifth Third would make electronic images of those payments, and the images would be processed at the bank's Cincinnati processing hub. So Fifth Third promised customers that it would reduce mail flow and speed up the collection process for their clients. We also could look at slowing down payments. So flow is also a component of the average payment period, the APP. So the firm could benefit by increasing all three components of its payment flow. One popular technique for increasing payment flow is controlled dispersing. This is a strategic use of mailing points in bank accounts to lengthen that mail flow and clearing flow respectively. We also could look at cash concentration, where the firm is using a process to bring lockbox and other deposits together into one bank called the concentration bank. It has three advantages. First, it's going to create a pool of funds for use in making short-term cash investments. Second, it's going to have cash in one account improves the tracking and internal control of that cash. And then third, having that enables the firm to implement payment strategies to reduce idle cash balances. Of course, a downside to all that pooling is that it could create a major problem if that institution were to fail. So a variety of mechanisms are available for transferring cash from the lockbox bank and other collection banks to the concentration bank. One of these is the depository transfer check, the DTC. It's an unsigned check drawn on one of a firm's bank accounts and deposited into another. The other is the ACH transfer, right? The automated clearinghouse transfer, which we see a lot of with if you go into a bank, a store, even an office like mine, we do an ACH transfer for you if you bring us a check. We don't mail it, we can process it right there. It's pre-authorized electronic withdrawal from the payer's account, deposited into the payee's account via a statement among banks provided by that automated clearinghouse by ACH. With that, we also could look at wire transfers. This is an electronic communication that, via those bookkeeping entries, it removes the funds from the payer's bank and deposits them into the payee's bank. They can eliminate that mail and clearing flow and might, reduce those processing floats as well. They're a substitute for the DTC and ACH transfers, but they are more expensive. And then we look at zero balance accounts, the ZBA. This is a disbursement account that always has an end of day balance of zero because the firm's depositing money to cover checks drawn on the account only as they're presented for payment each day. So once a given day's checks are presented for payment from the firm's ZBA, the bank notifies the firm of the total amount of checks. The firm transfers funds into the account to cover that day's worth of checks. This leaves an end of day balance of $0. It enables the firm to keep all its operating cash in an interest earning account, which eliminates that idle cash balance. So a firm that uses ZBA in conjunction with a cash concentration system would need two accounts. I have one of these as well. It's what we call as our premium account. So if anybody comes in to pay cash, then we have a separate checking system for this specific account. So at the end of the day, when the check clears from sending it to our home office and that payment system, then I, at the end of the day, have a zero balance in that account because those funds were used up to pay for that insured's premium. So the firm's going to concentrate the cash from the lock boxes and other collection banks into an interest earning account, and they would write checks against its ZBA. The firm would cover the exact dollar amount of checks presented against the ZBA with transfers from that interest account, leaving the end of day balance at $0, like I said. So here's a personal finance example. Megan Laurie, a 25-year-old nurse, she works at a hospital that pays her every 2 weeks by direct deposit into her checking account. No interest, no minimum balance requirements. She takes home about $1,800 or $3,600 per month. She maintains a $1,500 checking account balance, and whenever it exceeds that amount, she transfers the excess into her savings account, which currently pays 1% annual. She has currently savings balance of $17,000 and estimates that she transfers about $600 per month from her checking account into her savings account. She also pays her bills immediately when she receives them. Monthly bills average about $1,900, and her monthly cash outlays for food and gas are about $900. An analysis of her bill payments indicates that on average, she pays her bills 8 days early. She could also invest money in a mutual fund that invests in short-term and low-risk investments that pay 2%. She's interested in learning how she might better manage those cash balances. So she talked with her sister, who was head of finance course. They come up with 3 ways to better manage her cash balance. 1, she could invest current balances, right? She could transfer her current savings account balance into a low-risk mutual fund. So she's increasing the rate of interest from 1% to 2%. On her current $17,000 balance, she's going to immediately increase her interest earnings by about $170, okay? 2, she can invest those monthly surpluses. So transferring that $600 from the checking account to the mutual fund gets her about $6, which for the 12 transfers, you're looking at about $72 annually. Or she could slow down payments. So rather than her bills being paid immediately on receipt, she could pay them near her due date. By doing so, she gets $8 8 days of disbursement flow. So that would be 96 days per year. on average of $1,900 in bills. So assuming she can earn 2% annual interest on that 1,900, slowing down her payments would save her about $10 annually. So on the basis of these recommendations, Megan's going to increase her annual earnings by a total of about $252. So it's the 170 plus the 72 plus the 10. Finally, we can look at investing in marketable securities. These are those short-term, low-risk investments that are easy to buy and sell. They trade in very liquid markets. These securities most commonly held are divided into two groups: government issues, which have relatively low yields as a consequence of that low risk, and non-government issues, which have slightly higher yields than the government issues with similar maturities because they have a slightly higher risk associated with them. So here are some features of those marketable securities. We could look at treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury bonds, and those federal agency issues, okay? We could look at negotiable certificates of deposit, CDs, usually offered by banks. We could look at commercial paper, bankers' acceptances. And then we could look at the euro dollar deposits, the money market mutual funds, and repurchase agreements. So what did we learn in this chapter? We looked at working capital management on how we look at the current assets and the current liabilities and how that contributes to the firm's value. The net working capital is the difference between the two. And risk in the context of short-term decisions is probability that the firm's going to be unable to pay their bills as they come due. We looked at assuming a constant level of total assets. The higher the firm's ratio from the current assets to the total assets, the less profitable and less risky it is. The converse is also true. And with constant total assets, the higher the firm's ratio of current liabilities to total assets, the more profitable and more risky the firm is. We looked at the CCC and how it's got three components: the average age of inventory, the average collection period, and the average payment period. The length determines the amount of time resources are tied up in those day-to-day operations and how they consist of both permanent and seasonal funding requirements. The seasonal requirements can be using an aggressive, a low-cost, high-risk strategy or a conservative, high-cost, low-risk strategy. So ultimately, funding for this CCC depends on the disposition towards risk and the strength of those banking relationships. We looked at minimizing reliance on negotiated liabilities. We want to turn over inventory as quickly as possible, collect accounts receivable as quickly as possible, manage that mail processing and clearing times, and pay accounts payable as slowly as possible. Doing all of those strategies could minimize the length of that CCC. We also looked at inventory management, the viewpoints from marketing, manufacturing, purchasing managers, and how they tend to have higher inventories than those deemed appropriate by the financial manager. 4 techniques for managing inventory. We talked about the ABC system, the EOQ model, the JIT system, and those computerized systems, the MRP, MRP2, and the ERP. We looked at international inventory managers placing greater emphasis on making sure that they have enough quantity in inventory so they can deliver where and when needed in the right condition, then instead of ordering economically optimal quantities. We looked at credit selection and how that's determined by customers' credit worthiness, consistent with our firm's credit standards. We looked at the 5 C's of credit and credit scoring and how changes in credit standards can be evaluated mathematically by assessing that change on profits from the sales, cost of accounts receivable investment, and those bad debt costs. We looked at changes in credit terms like the discount period, and the credit period, and how they can be quantified similarly to changes in the credit standards. We also looked at credit monitoring, the ongoing review of accounts receivable, frequently involving the use of our average collection period and the aging schedule. We also looked at understanding management of receipts and disbursements, right? We looked at float, which refers to the funds that have been sent to the payer, but they're not yet usable. We also looked at mail time, processing time, and clearing time. Those are all components of flow. So it occurs in both average collection period and the average payment period. So one technique for speeding up collections is the lockbox system. A popular technique for slowing payments is controlled dispersing. So the goal for managing operating cash is to balance the opportunity cost of those non-bearing balances against those of temporary investments. So firms use a lot of depository transfer checks, those DTCs, ACH transfers, and wire transfers to transfer those lockbox receipts to their concentration banks quickly. And then we looked at zero balance accounts, those ZBAs, to eliminate those non-earning cash balances in our corporate checking accounts. And then finally, we looked at marketable securities that are short-term interest earning money market instruments to earn a temporary idle fund. And they could be government or non-government issues. So if you guys have any questions on this chapter, please let me know. A lot of it was that non-working capital. We looked at a lot of that. If you've got any questions on float time or want clarification on those zero balance accounts, just let me know. Hop on one of the Zoom calls. I know this is going to be almost our last week together, so please, if I haven't seen you, either reach out to me, let me know how you're doing, and I'll be checking in on you guys, okay? So we're going to be talking about chapter 16 and 18 next. So watch those videos as well and let me know if you have any questions there. Okay, thanks, guys.